This is Research Like a Pro, episode 201, Coming to the Table and African American Research with Suzanne Lowe. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hello, everybody. Welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you today?
Hi, Mom. I'm great. I'm just enjoying the DNA study group and the opportunity to play around with some of the DNA tools like auto-segment and, of course, my favorite tool, Gephi, which I've been practicing using. What about you?
I've been working on recreating my Royston surname project. It was a Y-DNA project that we did with Sorensen Genomics in 2006, and those results were sold to Ancestry, and then I think it was 2015, Ancestry deleted all of it because of a controversy in the press and DNA and law enforcement. And so it was really sad that we lost that in the database, but all the test takers kept their either digital or their paper results. And so I've been gathering those up from various people and then entering them into the MITA Y DNA website, which lets you you have to manually put in your actual markers for Y-DNA. So I've been recreating that project and then writing a blog post about it. So it's been kind of fun because I was feeling so sad that I would not have access to that project. And so now I have it all together. There were 6 test takers. 5 of them matched our Virginia Royston ancestor, and 1 did not, and he is part of the Maryland line, and it was just fun looking at it and seeing how much he differed, like very different Y-DNA signatures. It's been a fun project. It was a little time consuming doing the manual data entry because once you put the numbers in, you can't go back and edit it. And I made a couple mistakes, so I had to redo it. I was getting really fast though by the end after I'd redone a kit about 3 times. I thought I was being so careful, but sometimes it's just like a lot of little numbers you're trying to put in on your screen.
Right, all
So
those STR repeats, and there's 46 markers in that Sorensen test, right? So
yeah. But the website MITA Y DNA actually makes it really easy to do it. Don't get me wrong. It was my connection between my brain and the computer trying to make sure I had the numbers right. So it was really fun, and I'm really excited to have it redone. And I also drew out the lucid chart diagram of each of the test takers and their direct line back, which when we first did this, I didn't even know that you were supposed to do that. And so I've learned so much about DNA since then and, put it all together. It was pretty fun over the weekend to work on that.
right? What year did you do all this testing?
2006.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Well, good job getting that recreated. I'm excited that we have that now to access and see and view that evidence.
Right. And interestingly enough, of those 6 test takers, only 1 is still living.
Wow.
And you have to get permission from a living person to enter their test in, which I did. But if they're deceased, you don't worry about it. So, that was, I guess, helpful for me that I didn't have to try to get permission from each of the men.
Well, thanks for sharing. Well, our announcements today are that we have the study group in the fall, Research Like a Pro, that begins in September, and we'll have registration in the summer. And if you'd like to be a peer group leader, you can apply on our website. We'd love to have new peer group leaders. And finally, if you would like to join our weekly newsletter, each week we send an email on Monday with our new blog posts and podcast episodes. And occasionally we'll have coupon codes in there for some of our classes and study groups.
Well, we're excited to introduce our guest today. We have Suzanne Lowe here with us. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, how are you, Nicole? Hi, Diana.
We're so glad you agreed to come on the podcast and talk about your experiences with genealogy and your ancestry. So let me give a little bio, and then we're going to jump in and ask you all sorts of questions because I am so curious about a lot of things here. So Suzanne Campbell Lowe has spent the majority of her adult life researching her family's genealogy, In 2005, she learned from a white cousin about the Campbell family's connection through slavery to a black man named James Meredith. Over the course of the next several years, Suzanne's white and black families have built their relationships and explored their descendancy from their common ancestor, a prominent white leader of the Confederacy named J.A.P. Campbell, which is short for Josiah Abigail Patterson Campbell. Suzanne joined a group called Coming to the Table, and a linked descendant subgroup of that large group in the fall of 2021. In the group's Get Acquainted conversation, she shares some of her family's story and the connections between Meredith and Campbell families. She told the attendees that her cousin, iconic Blacks' Right activist James Meredith, saw the reconnection of the Meredith Campbell families as a key possibility for healing and overcoming white supremacy. Wow, so interesting. And then interesting other things about Suzanne that she shared with us is that she has concentrated her last 25 years of genealogy work on her northern family. And then 2.5 years ago, she moved to North Carolina to concentrate more on her southern family. So that's fun. How's that going with your North Carolina research?
Well, it's a bit overwhelming, but it's good, a good kind of overwhelming. With my expanded perspectives about the interactions between the enslaved and enslavers and the descendants from those, I now am seeing my kind of discovery of my white ancestry, the North Carolina white ancestry, in a completely different light. For example, I discovered a website called I think I'm not going to get this right probably, but First Families of North Carolina, which is really actually a depiction of white people who had plantations and people of means. Now I have come to have some skepticism about how dare we call ourselves first families, right?
Mm.
We aren't really first at all. So all the work I've been doing, discovering my connections to my Black cousins, has changed my understanding about how we account for ourselves, how we name ourselves in history. So, yeah, I am descended from what I think are 5 or 6 families on this list, but it's not really first. I don't believe that at all.
Well, we did have this group of people here before us, right? All the indigenous people, the Native Americans, lots of different tribes that were actually here first. So
Yep.
it is interesting how we look at things, and it's really good to explore these ideas. It makes us better researchers when we do that. So I just wanted to mention my connection, like how I discovered you. We had one of our, I think she was a reader or a listener. Anyway, Connie Davis reached out to me and told me about this Coming to the Table project. And she had done some work with another project called the U.S. Black Heritage Project at WikiTree. And I was really interested in that and asked her to write a blog post for us on Family Locket, which she did. And then she said, you also might want to know about Suzanne Lowe and the work that she's doing and her story. And then she sent me a link to the video, and I watched that and was so fascinated. Can you just tell our listeners a minute about what that was all about? You know, how that culminated all of this work that you had done?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. We had a picnic, Blacks and white descendants of Josiah Abigail Patterson Campbell, last April 2021 in Jackson, Mississippi. At that time, many family members said, wow, we must tell our story. It's a very unique story, as I'll share if you'd like during our time today. It was an interesting process to try to find an organization that would be willing to work with us as we created something that had never been created before. And Coming to the Table was the perfect partner. It has a linked descendants group, as you've mentioned, and it is a place where people who are working across the color lines, if you will, whether they are actually cousins by blood or not, but linked descendants, they have been linked through being descended from an enslaver or the enslaved. we created a story about J.A.P. Campbell and his connection to his Black family. It's not a hugely unique story in that more and more we learn that white Confederate leaders, white plantation owners did have relations with the women who were working on their plantations. Nowadays, you may not have a statistic about this, but I would argue the majority of American Blacks, especially in the South, have had some descendants from a white person. It's not unusual now to find that out. Well, when we put our program together, we worked across the cousin lines, fascinating perspectives, research that each side had done, oral history on the part of the Black cousins mostly, but also artifacts, etc., from the white side. We shared wills, we shared pictures of items. We created this presentation, and Coming to the Table hosted it for us February 20th, 2022. And yes, the 90-minute recording is now on YouTube. It's fascinating time together.
Oh, that's great. Well, we can link to that in the show notes because I really enjoyed watching that and learning about both the J.A.P. Campbell and then James Meredith, who I had never heard of, this Black rights activist. And it was fascinating to learn a little bit more about both sides of the story and to see, the cousins, the Black and the white cousins coming together and talking. Such a great role model, I think, for anyone discovering that type of ancestry. So, yeah, I'm so glad that I was able to get connected with you and your project and see what you've been doing.
Thank you.
We have mentioned coming to the table a couple times, and for anybody listening who doesn't know what that is, can you just tell us what is the Coming to the Table organization?
Certainly. And I would encourage people to click on the link that I know you will put in your show notes also. I am relatively new to this organization. It's a nonprofit. I believe it's around 15 years old or so. I believe there are about 6,000 plus members across the country and maybe internationally even. It is Blacks, it is whites, people who are working together to overcome the legacy of slavery. I think mostly focused on the United States. Of course, as we know, slavery is an international quote unquote institution, and slavery does exist even today. But it is an organization dedicated to working together to help us heal from the racial injustice of slavery.
Thank you for describing that.
Sure.
Have you ever had people question about the DNA proof for your Black cousins?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In my search to find a partner to help us tell our unique story, I did approach an organization that I thought might be a good partner for us. Their focus is genealogical research. I told them the story about our unique connection, the work that James Meredith himself has done to shed to light the white supremacy activities of our common ancestor, J.A.P. Campbell, who was, when he died in 1917, the last living signer of the Confederate States of America Constitution.
Hmm.
Sharing these details with this particular organization, and of course, the very strong oral history that has been passed down through the generations on the Meredith side. I was really, really surprised when they said, well, you know, we are a research organization, and in order to work with you, we would have to explore all of the various platforms for credibility. And we would require Mr. Meredith or a male member of the Meredith family to take a DNA test to prove lineage with the white Campbell side.
Hmm.
I was, to put it mildly, shocked about this. And I did speak to Mr. Meredith about this. He said, absolutely not. There is enough circumstantial evidence that it would be an insult, he said, to be asked to prove it. Just another form of racial discrimination, he said. And I happen to agree with him that the bottom line is DNA is a relatively recent research tool, and oral history is, in fact, it should be, I suppose, an accepted pathway to explore further connections between whites and blacks. There is no reason why they could not have explored a partnership with us. I imagine someday someone will do some kind of DNA proof.
Mm-hmm.
But I must say, there are so many physical pieces of evidence, for example, health issues that have been passed down through the Campbell line, both to the white Campbells and the black Merediths. I don't need DNA proof.
Well, that's such an interesting question. Is there enough documentary evidence and oral tradition that, we don't need that DNA? And I think that's just fine for him to say no, that, and oftentimes there is plenty of documentary evidence for a relationship. So, in genealogy standards, it just says that to claim that it's a biological relationship, genetic evidence is used, but that, in all of the studying that we've done about this topic, it comes down to the question of families exist in many different forms, and the family who raised a person or who they lived with or who they were associated with is often the family that we can prove with that oral tradition and the documentary evidence. And so, unless we're dying to prove that there's an actual blood genetic kinship, often we don't need to incorporate that DNA evidence. And I think that's really fortunate that the group didn't want to work with you without that DNA evidence, because many people are not comfortable with DNA testing, and so that can be an issue to think about as well.
Totally agree.
Yeah, that is an interesting perspective. And I love what you said, Nicole, that it is just about families, and DNA does not need to be involved in every single bit of our family history. Well, Suzanne, I think I can guess the answer to this question, but how did you become interested in African American research?
I'll remember the day very vividly in 2005. As you've mentioned in your intro, I was shown an article written by James Meredith, who I knew from my history studies in school. The article was called The Father of White Supremacy. And my jaw just hit the floor as I read this article, talking in great detail and, yes, with amazing documentary evidence about this connection. J.A.P. Campbell is my cousin James Meredith's great grandfather. And this gentleman, J.A.P. Campbell, is my great great grandfather. And I was very surprised to read information about this gentleman with way more specificity than I ever heard from my own grandfather, my own father. It just caused an explosion on my part, an explosion of research about the Civil War, about slavery, and about the relationships between enslavers and the enslaved. It sort of set me off on this trajectory of realizing how variable it is, the way people capture history. I just mentioned oral history, but I found out there were writings from my ancestor, J.A.P. Campbell, writings by him and writings about him. I plunged into looking at census records, etc., and I found, so many mysteries, so many things that were verified. It's really actually been a lifelong interest now since that time in 2005. It's just a new look at the history of the United States and about my understanding of what happened and how my family was involved in what happened.
I think that is true for anyone that finds this. And we've certainly seen it in our own ancestry, and we see it in that of our clients or other people we talk with. You're doing your research on your Southern ancestor, and then you get a hint that they're in the slave schedule, and then you see that they owned several slaves, and it can rock your world. It can be really distressing, but the whole genealogy, family history focus really helps, to make these connections, which is exactly what you found with discovering the Meredith connection. So in the video, I was really interested that when you called John Meredith, who was the oldest son of James, correct?
Yes.
You were nervous. Tell us just a little bit about that phone call.
Oh, it was actually my call to James Meredith, John's father. I
Oh,
did tell
okay.
the story. Yeah, no, it's a good question. Having read this article in 2005, it did rock my world. It took me probably 2 weeks to get my mind around the fact that I had a Black cousin and that my family, my white family, had never talked about this. Knowing at the time also how much James Meredith had done to advocate for Black citizenship rights, the fact that there was an army, the National Guard was called to the campus of Ole Miss, University of Mississippi. People died in 1962 so that he could go to college. I felt that he might be fairly bitter against white people, and I was nervous then, not only about his fame, because he's continued to advocate for total Black citizenship rights. uh, you know, I'll be honest, I was just, a nervous white woman, not having had a lot of connection to Blacks. And here I was thinking about introducing myself to one as my cousin. I called him up. His phone number was not hard to find on the internet. I was kind of shocked that he answered the phone by himself on the first or second ring. And I said, Mr. Meredith, my name is Suzanne Campbell Lowe. I have learned about your article, The Father of White Supremacy, and I'm also done a lot of family genealogical research. I believe we might be cousins. And then there was this long pause. I thought my heart was going to leap out of my chest. I thought he's going to hang up on me or I will be yelled at. Instead, he said, Well, I've been waiting for this call for 50 years.
Oh my goodness. I just think that's amazing. And then look at what's come of it.
Yeah,
What a
yeah.
great story.
It did require some bravery on my part, given his very public stance about overcoming white supremacy and recognizing my own white privilege. Nothing I've done myself. It was just bestowed upon me. And realizing that part of that was because my white Confederate great great grandfather wrote laws that are still in place in the United States today that have hardwired white supremacy, and I'm the recipient of that.
Yeah. We all have everything in our family background, don't we? We've got all types of ancestors.
Yes,
Some of them were good, some of them maybe not so good.
yes,
We want to
yes,
believe the best of them, but there are facts that we are not always excited about.
yes, ma'am.
What advice would you give to anyone who has recently discovered European African American descendancy, either from an enslaver or an enslaved individual?
Well, I would have 3 points to make on that. Not in particular order, but here we go. The first point would be to prepare for frustration. Whites are used to expecting a ton of accuracy, and depending on the written word, we look for evidence, as we've talked about already. We look for documentation, we look for census records, we look for, taxation, and we look for land grants. These things were well documented for the whites side of our history. I used to be a stickler for these kinds of sources, and I still search for them. I still am a stickler for them. But my understanding about research for African American descendancy and ancestry is different in Blacks. Black history is much more orally based, as you've already heard me mention. I have labored to keep up with my Black cousins who have just a stunning amount of knowledge of history. and family connections and things that happened that have been passed down over the course of generations. Storytelling is so huge in the Black tradition. And folks, this is as credible as what you find in the books. In fact, I would argue it's incumbent upon me as a white genealogical researcher to capture this information. I've tried to do that. The stories about how J.A.P. Campbell would sit on the side of the town green and instruct his Black grandson in the ways of the world, the importance of land ownership, the importance of self esteem and confidence. They were not allowed to document this. These things were against the law, literally, in those days, in post Civil War years. But they are, in fact, the truth. These things actually happened. And my own next step is to create a website on my Confederate ancestor, this guy, J.A.P. Campbell, and targeting it to academicians and historians and researchers and journalists and students and anybody who wants a centralized source for information on a very complex man who's outlining, he was the architect of white supremacy laws that, as I've mentioned, are in the books today, but he also advocated for his Black family, and this has not been documented. So we're going to try to document some of these things through capturing the oral traditions that, if not documented, they become disappeared because they will die with the people who didn't get to write them down. So frustration is my first point.
That's a real common problem, I think, in African American genealogy research, with having little direct evidence of relationships that far back in time because of the lack of record keeping for African Americans and the enslaved. And so I'm glad you said that first, that it is frustrating.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I do see more now is being written. I've mentioned to you both a book called The Other Madisons by a woman named Betty Kersey. And I sent you a link about that. It's a story about a Black family who, oral tradition, they are descended from the United States' fourth president, James Madison. They also don't have DNA evidence, but my gosh, the story is, oh my gosh, hundreds of pages of fascinating, credible oral history about this family. Another is, you might have heard about George Washington's, this quote unquote speculation of whether or not he had a Black son named West Ford. There's also a link to a Wikipedia article about him. He was a slave who was freed after the Civil War. You kind of look at that as, well, that's oral history too.
Yeah, thank you for including the link to that Wikipedia article about West Ford. And that's, something interesting to research.
Yeah,
President George
yeah,
Washington's family, and it just reminds me of the very first genetic genealogy article that came out in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly about Sally Hemings and her children as well.
yes.
And so it's definitely a topic that a lot of genealogists are interested in and something that we could all learn more about. So thank you.
You're welcome. And the second point would be just to read up on the general culture of slavery. I have just devoured as many books that I can get on the whole idea of what it was like during those times. One that I liked a lot, it's very, very academic, but it's got some interesting stuff. It's called Within the Plantation Household, subtitled Black and White Women of the Old South, by Elizabeth Fox Genovese. It's published by UNC Press. Well, I did not know a lot about what it was like being on a plantation for a Black person, for white people. We think that Blacks just had an oral tradition because that's just the way they did it. Well, in fact, they were not allowed to learn to read and write. We made it that they didn't have a way to write things down. We did not catalog them until the 1850 and the 1860 censuses, the slave schedules, as you've referenced. But slavery had been around for, gosh, hundreds of years before that. So I just think, for one who has discovered European and African American descendancy, Just really do your homework on the entire culture, the general culture of slavery, and you'll get a much better sense of what you're facing as you get deeper and deeper into the research question. The last point is, if you do have the opportunity to connect with, even if it's not by blood, but as we say, linked descendants, maybe you've discovered some descendants of slaves from a particular white family member that you are connected to from the days of slavery. If you happen to find blood relations like I did, just get to know them. We, for example, are doing a monthly family Zoom. I facilitate this with the Black Merediths and the White Campbells. We have introduced ourselves to many, many white and Black cousins. The circle is expanding. And we have sometimes difficult conversations. We just had a difficult conversation the other night, actually, about how much do we want to say about white supremacy? Is it going to derail our connections and our growing, deepening relationships with each other? How can we, in fact, face this whole arena? But the point of our family program on February 20th, 2022, was that family love can be the beginning of racial healing, and that we might all benefit from listening to each other.
What a laudable Zoom call, a family reunion, whatever you want to call it. How wonderful that you're doing that and continuing the relationship after that, first phone call with your cousin, and then continuing to spend time together and get to know each other. And what a wonderful and healing step that is.
Yeah, we are actually working together to find more documentary evidence of the woman who was the beginning of the Meredith line, a slave named Millie Brown. Where was she? Who enslaved her? Where did she live after the Civil War? And working together with my Black cousins to find her has been very rewarding.
That's so neat. And I'm so excited to take a look at the book that you recommended, Within the Plantation Household, Black and White Women of the Old South. I looked at the link and it looks like you can preview quite a bit of the book. It's a big book, but there's a lot that you can see just online to give you some really good context about what this was like. So I always appreciate recommendations for good books. And our listeners know that if I get that, I'll be sharing from it, as I like to do.
Thank you.
So we're probably getting to the end of our podcast, but just a couple more questions. What erroneous assumptions did you bring into your search for your enslaver ancestors?
I guess one of my erroneous assumptions was that I would have no trouble finding information about even someone famous. In fact, there are some unsavory aspects of his life that I believe have been suppressed. Back to the notion of being frustrated, even in our research about historical events, there are certain facts that are hard to verify, and it takes real diligence and not just an internet search. I mean, I'm going to have to go to various law libraries. I've, in fact, found there are special collections. I would encourage some of your listeners who are finding gaps in some of their genealogical research. If you happen to know, for example, where an ancestor went to college or high school, or a public institution where that person might have been involved. I have found documents that have been donated to special collections libraries that are not on the internet. So I guess I would say my erroneous assumptions were that I could just find stuff on the internet. It's not the case. It's not all there.
I'm really glad you said that because, especially for African American research, you do have to dig a lot deeper and it's not as easy. There are better things being put out there all the time, but still, and it takes discipline, don't you think, just tracking it down?
Yeah, and perseverance. The article that James Meredith wrote, I mean, it is not in common circulation, but it opened up a treasure trove of knowledge about our family that genealogical research by itself could not have discovered.
That's
It's a
great.
giant puzzle.
It is. It is. Well, for someone listening and they've just discovered, some connection to an African American person, whether enslaved or not, because there were free people of color also, in the family tree. But what would you recommend for just getting started?
Oh, just getting started. I would highly recommend your own podcasts. I hope you'll tell people those podcasts that I think it was a series of 3 or 4 about African American research. And I had done a lot of the same things that you have said in your series, but not all of them. And for anybody who's just getting started, I would really recommend your podcasts on African American research.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I took that series from an institute course I took from Dr. Deborah Abbott, who is just a wonderful researcher and teacher. And so it's part of my learning process, to spit it back out in another format, which became blog posts and then podcasts. So it helps me remember what I've learned. And so I'm so glad it was helpful for you. That's
Yes,
great.
yes.
Yeah, those were episodes 121 through 124, and they're also based on blog posts if you prefer reading. So you can check that out in the show notes. We'll have links to those.
All right. Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and telling us your story and just giving such a great perspective on what you're doing with, to use the term of the website, coming to the table with your Black cousins and making these connections. I think that's just really exciting to see that happening. So thank you.
You're entirely welcome, and I'm happy to connect with you again if that's what you'd like to do.
Thanks so much. I hope you all listening enjoyed this episode, and we will talk to you again next week. Bye bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.